This computer. Okay. Uh, Welcome, Zamzam Dini. Zamzam is a doctoral student, kind of completing, kind of in the last stages of her doctoral degree at the University of Minnesota. She's a marriage and family therapy doctoral student and has agreed to interview with us today. You know, Zam, we're very interested in kind of knowing a little bit about your pathway to this field and why family therapy as opposed to something else, and what model do you practice from? And so I'll be quiet a little bit and let you talk.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and for, listening to my story. I guess how I kind of came about to marriage and family therapy, I've always wanted to be a clinician. I've always been curious about like how people experience things or why people do a certain thing. And so I've always kind of knew that I wanted to be a clinician, but I kind of always also assumed that the only way to do that was to become like a psychologist. And so I did my undergrad in psychology and didn't really feel like it was a good fit for me. There was a lot of talk about the individual and what the person was doing and how can we help this specific individual. And kind of the focus was on, well, what can you do to get out of your situation? And there wasn't really any other follow-up questions about, how could this person's maybe environment be impacting how they are showing up, or like what does the family have to do with how this person is, experiencing this. And I felt like there was a lot of pieces missing that really wasn't addressed when I in my undergrad. And fast forwarding a little bit, I was under the assumption that once I become a clinician, once I become a licensed psychologist, I could practice any way I want. So let's just kind of get through this major and get this degree. And ironically, I was looking at graduate programs and came across marriage and family therapy. And as somebody who is a kind of minority, but also has a lot of intersecting identities, I've always grown up in this understanding that it's always a both and, right? There's no kind of one right way to do things. There's always, we can do it by, we can follow A or we can also follow B. That doesn't mean that kind of B is incorrect or A is incorrect. And I've always like lived in that gray area and was very comfortable with it. And also had this like shared understanding with a lot of other, BIPOC communities that there are systems at play. There are kind of larger institutions that influence and impact how you experience the world. And when I came across marriage and family therapy and they talked about having this systemic approach, I was really shocked. Like nobody really talked about different types of mental health disciplines. And B, I was shocked that like an entire like discipline was kind of focusing on this type of thinking that I thought like only I,
Yeah.
had this understanding. Like I felt like it was something that I like convinced myself of to sort of soothe the kind of gaps I was noticing. But I didn't create this. I did not make it up, apparently.
Yeah, so
um,
so there was something that resonated. I mean, you said this both and worldview. This I lived in the gray, and so when you heard about this finally, or when you finally got to hear this,
yeah.
it just resonated with how you see the world, the systemic interrelatedness.
I was so excited. I felt like psychology was so distant from the way that the communities I wanted to serve like moved about in the world. And MFT and systemic thinking in particular brought that gap a little bit closer. Like I can't really map on an entire community's experience to one particular thing, but I felt like I could kind of communicate what therapy is, what mental health treatment is, using systemic language and understanding that the majority of the world kind of already aligns itself with. And I just felt like it was a very easier kind of way to approach these underserved communities.
Yeah. So within family therapy, within the family systems, especially the clinical approaches, is there one or are there more than one approach that kind of speak to you and that you see that guides how you operate with clients?
Mhm. I would say initially when I was in my graduate program, I was very drawn to like Bowen family systems theory. Just the ability to talk about family of origin and have multi-generational genograms. It was such a different and contrasting experience from my psychology degree that I was like, I am going all for it. Like I'm only doing Bowen. And as I learned about other theories, I also came across experiential family therapy. And that also kind of, it felt like the other side of the coin, where with Bowen, I can talk about family of origin and your history, and that doesn't get lost in translation. But with experiential family therapy, I'm also able to kind of help you process what's happening for you right now in the moment, and kind of even focus on what is your body experiencing. We're not just, all in our head and having a very cerebral or cognitively focused conversation. And I think due to my specialization in trauma and doing and focusing on PTSD, I've also come to integrate interpersonal neurobiology, but that's really just understanding the biological mechanisms of relationships. And so it just gives me different language to talk about trauma, but but it's not really anything different from, I would say, like experiential, where experiential is like the felt experience. And I think neurobiology is like the biological like explanations of what you're feeling.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you for that introduction. I have a feeling a lot of the people who are watching this or might watch this will resonate with your experience. I have that same kind of experience in my psych classes, and then when I took a family science class, was like, wow, this is what I thought I was going to get in psych. So,
Mhm.
hey, if you could describe a well-known intervention, kind of like from the theoretical standpoint, like for example, in structural family therapy, they do enactments in session. But I'd love for you to kind of describe one of those interventions and maybe give a specific or give an example of how it might work out in a fictional, role, not a role play, but a fictional therapeutic vignette.
Yeah. So when I think about like experiential family therapy, a lot of it is really based on not having a plan and just kind of being authentic and showing up in the way that you need to, and just kind of going with the flow. And I think that is a really kind of cool way to approach therapy, because if we think about like our society in general, we're a very much fast-paced society where we always are focused on producing and doing things. And if we're not kind of busy or accomplishing things, we're either lazy or we're wasting time. This whole concept like time is money. We really do put value in the amount of work that we're doing. But when we come to like juggle a lot of different things, it really takes away from us experiencing things in the moment. We don't give, or we don't have the opportunity to give our 100% intentional commitment and sort of to the experience that we have. I think the only time that really happens is when we do something for the very first time. So if you're like doing your hair for the first time, you're trying a new style, or you downloaded a new app and you're like really paying attention to like what's happening. But after we kind of get used to what to expect, we automatically bypass the entire experience and just go on to like pilot mode or autopilot.
Yeah.
And a good example of this is like driving. The second, you turn those keys on, we're focused on what we're going to do after we get to our destination because we already know what the driving entails. And like if you're a good driver, hopefully you have some kind of, you're paying attention to your surroundings. But then if I try to like give my 100% attention to my surroundings, now I'm distracted. So you kind of are in this like weird place where you're passive and there's like some attention, but you really don't have the like opportunity to like hold the steering wheel, feel what it's like to hold it, be in that seat. We really don't have intentional moments of driving. And I think experiential family therapy and this concept of like here and now takes that and it kind of flips it on its head. We're not only just going to talk about like an interaction or an argument that you had with your partner, but we're really going to talk about like how did you feel in that moment? How did you experience the interaction? And so it's less about content. Oftentimes couples get caught up in the details, like I said this and you said that. And so we kind of like press pause on that and we really slow down the experience so that both people can really let go of like responding to the defense mechanisms that experiential family therapy kind of explains, but we really have a conversation about, well, what were you experiencing and kind of how did these words make you feel? And how did that kind of encourage you to respond in this certain way?
Mm.
A rule of thumb that we kind of have for experiential family therapy is like making sure that the client has a different experience with you than they have outside of the room. And so a really good example that comes to my mind is I was working with this couple and they were kind of caught up in the usual conversation about I said this and they said that, and they were kind of getting caught up in the details. And one of the partners said something that might have felt maybe untrue for the other client. And instead of kind of like saying that out loud, they kind of looked at me and gave me a very pointed look and didn't really say anything else. And so in that moment, I was able to kind of like pause the conversation and highlight the fact that like, hey, you you made a gesture that had a very significant meaning to you because you wanted to communicate it to me. However, we didn't communicate that same kind of gesture to your partner. So like what was that, look about, like what is it that you want to share that you feel like you can't be more direct about it? And we were able to stop the conversation and really just allow the client their space to be able to share. Like when she said that, it really made me feel like misunderstood and unheard. And as a clinician, I also see like that gesture as a way of the client kind of asking for help and asking for some kind of reinforcement or validation. And usually like, like how often do we respond to like nonverbal conversations out loud? How often do we make them explicit? We really just kind of laugh it off or kind of assume we know what the person is thinking. But nonverbal communications are just as important. And with experiential family therapy, I'm able to kind of gauge that and really look at the person. The client is telling me that they're fine, they're okay with the breakup, but their leg is shaking and they're being very fidgety, right? And so you get to sort of highlight that and say, hey, like I'm noticing like this is happening in your body. Like, why don't we take a moment and actually like feel like what does it feel to be okay? Like what does your body need to feel like for you to think that you're okay? And so we're also bridging that gap between our kind of our rationalized brain and our embodied experience, which is excellent for trauma therapy as well, which is a population that I work with.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. So just making that in family therapy, sometimes we talk about making the covert overt, right? And so there was this glance between you and a client, and you called attention to it, paused the conversation, and then said, "What did you want to communicate? And is this a message that you wanted to share with your partner as well?" And it probably led to some rich discussion about how they were feeling, and specifically feeling unseen, or maybe unheard or misunderstood at that moment. Are
Mhm.
there Would you say there's any contextual challenges with applying this model, practicing
Mhm.
according to this, either experiential or Bowen or your unique
Yeah.
combination of those models?
Yeah, I would definitely say, especially when I ask those kind of questions around like what are you feeling in the moment? Like if you don't have knowledge or vocabulary to go with that, it's really hard to carry that conversation. And I notice sometimes it's maybe like a gendered role where we kind of assume like, female identifying individuals have more capacity to and are also conditioned and socialized to be more in tune with their emotions, to be able to carry emotionally sort of focused conversations, and are also conditioned to be nurturing and caring. But then we see our kind of male identified individuals in society where emotions are seen as a weakness, or the only acceptable emotion is anger. And so when you ask somebody who hasn't had the opportunity from birth to talk about their emotions and to identify what emotion they're feeling, it's really hard to have any type of conversation. And it can bring up some kind of shame or guilt or even like dismissing behavior, because people get embarrassed. Like if I ask them a question like, well, what did you feel in that moment? And they say, well, I thought it was unfair. Right. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds like a thought. So like, what does it feel like in your body to sort of have that experience? And then it really is difficult for them to identify a word or an emotion that really captivates what they're experiencing, because they didn't have that opportunity when they were growing up because of gendered roles in our society. Um, and I think that is kind of one thing that I've noticed. Like, and when that does happen, we do have to take a couple steps back and do some more like psychoeducation and probing, and to be able to help them build the vocabulary and build the capacity to have those emotionally focused conversations first before we can get into the deep kind of work that needs to happen.
When I teach these family therapy foundational models, and one of the theorists that's identifies as experiential is Virginia Satir. And when I watch her work, okay, these are old videos, they're 50 years old or whatever. She's touching everyone, she's got her arms around people, and I think to myself, and I kind of lean towards some experiential work, but I feel like I don't know in this environment, like we're a different kind of society now. I don't know that I could get away with touching people the way she did. I don't even know if I feel comfortable doing it myself, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I think me, like my positionality, like who I am and how I show up would be very different than Virginia Satir. And she could get away with touch and things like that. Maybe there are some people that can't quite apply that experiential model in the same way that
Yeah.
they've seen Virginia Satir do it. Do you have thoughts about those kinds of things?
Yeah, especially with, the clients that I see that have trauma experience, right? Like maybe touching is not the safest interaction to have with them. And it's about, being aware of that and having conversations with your client. And if we can't like physically touch them, like there's also other ways that we can kind of help them orient or have that same experience. So like psychodrama, we can kind of direct them and like have them do actions and be more kind of directive that way, without having to like move them.
Mm,
Or physical there, like the physical touch can be amongst like family members. Or what I like about experiential family therapy is that there's a lot of creativity that is allowed. And so you can have, like animal assisted therapy. I wish I had a horse, but like equine therapy, right? And so you could practice touch with animals, or, play therapy using toys that are sort of life size. There's a lot of different things that we can do, because we're focusing on the experience. And if we're able to kind of shift that experience for them in any what way, it's just as sort of important and effective as if I was able to like hold my client.
yeah, great feedback. Yeah, I told you I'd be brief. Do you have any words of advice for people interested in marriage and family therapy or these models, Bowen or
Yeah.
symbolic experiential models?
Yeah, I would say the thing with marriage and family therapy that kind of makes us a little bit unique in the mental health field or the disciplines is that a lot of what we work with are relationships, and relationships are values based. So if we're talking about parenting or kind of couples therapy, it really is based on like how we show up in the world is really based on what our values are and how we've seen models of how to show up as people, i.e. our family of origin. And I would just say, just being mindful of that, like as clinicians, we always have um our clients' best interests at heart, but we're also people too. And so being mindful of what does, what is my sort of subjective point of view, what biases or stereotypes do I hold, and how am I sort of consciously making sure that that doesn't kind of play into how I view families or couples, or how to even, be a human being. I think when we incorporate relationships, things get messy, and that's the whole point of it. But just being mindful that you're a person too, and that, like you're not kind of an isolated experience. You're also part of the system, and kind of approaching the family and the individual with humility and respect, especially with clients that have experienced trauma. I think making sure that we remind ourselves, like, we can't expect vulnerability from our clients. We have to like earn that trust and earn that connection. And so that starts with empathy and compassion. And if you approach any client with empathy and compassion first, then it's much easier to build that connection and then help them move about through growth and change in their life.
Yeah, love it. Zam, thank you so much for being with us today. I know a lot of people are going to benefit from this, and that experiential model is one that a lot of students gravitate toward because it is so consistent with how they see the world and how they want to be in it. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. Take care.